From encounters with sinister hitchhikers to eerie sightings on deserted backroads, these stories are not for the faint of heart. Join us as we navigate the twists and turns of these three true horrifying road trip tales, where the darkness of the night becomes a canvas for fear to paint its most harrowing scenes. Story 1: The Mysterious Trap. It was in 2011 when I was driving my car from New York to Georgia. I planned to spend the week with relatives in Georgia's countryside. It was going to be a 14-hour and 50-minute journey, so I intended to complete it all in one day. I got on the road at 10:00 a.m. I went for lunch at a deli once, and then 4 hours later, I stopped at a rest spot to eat the turkey sandwiches I had brought in my cooler. After that, I didn't intend to make further stops, except for gasoline, of course. At about 12:30 p.m., I had just filled up the tank once again, and I now had an ETA of around 1:30. I must admit that I am becoming very tired right now. I didn't consider getting coffee at the petrol station for some reason. The GPS path from the petrol station appeared weird. I wasn't on the highway anymore. Instead, it was driving me down some country roads. My vehicle sits high up, so I have an awesome view of everything, and I also had a light bar fitted, which helped to light up the pitch-black highways. I was exhausted and knew I shouldn't have been driving further, but I was so close to my aunt's house that I had to continue. I got to a stop sign and took a left off some quiet roads onto an even quieter route. The speed limit for this route was 45, which was acceptable. There were no structures or residences along this route. There were only woods on each side. I was traveling around 55 to 60 mph, burning down this road because it appeared that no other cars would be on this sort of route at this hour. And just then, I noticed 4 shining things approaching quickly in front of me. I immediately slammed on the brakes, and as I approached, I saw what they were: traffic drums, similar to those large cylinder traffic cones. My vehicle came to a halt before ramming into the drums. I stepped out of my truck, armed with my baseball bat, and approached the traffic drums, only to discover that there was something else behind them. It was a spike trap, similar to those that the police use. I wasn't sure what to think. Is there some sort of police activity going on? Or has someone put this up as a trap? As I backed up to my truck, I warily peered around. Then I heard a scream for help. The scream came from the trees to the left of the road. There was no way I was going into those woods. The most I was willing to do was shout out loud what was wrong, but no one responded. I stepped to the side of the road and gazed into the trees. The only reason I could see anything was due to the lights on my truck. And then I noticed him out of the corner without looking at him directly. Without looking straight at him, I noticed someone hunched behind a few bushes. I didn't sprint. I just walked back to my car. When I went inside and closed the door, I noticed 2 figures approaching my truck on the side of the road near the edge of the trees. I drove the truck to the right side of the road, onto the dirt, and through the spike trap. I don't suppose they expected me to go around, but as I peered in the rearview mirror, I noticed at least 3 figures standing by the traffic drums, temporarily interrupted by my truck's taillights. They vanished from my sight and my existence in a matter of seconds. I never anticipated this to happen to me, but I'm pleased I did come out of it alive. Now, before we move on to the next story, quickly subscribe to our channel Top Scares to get more intriguing horror stories that will blow your mind. You can also like, share, and comment on this video. Story 2: Ghost in the Wood. When I was younger, my family and I took a road trip to Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. It took us around 17 hours from our location to get there. It took us many days of on and off traveling to get there, and during the nights, we would attempt to locate a little motel to stay in. My father attempted to drive through the night one night, since we were running late. He probably made it into the wee hours of the night before deciding it was unsafe and parking us in this small unlit rest stop amid the woods in some flyover state. My brothers and I had fallen asleep in the van many hours before Dad pulled over, so we were all sleeping in this dark little parking lot surrounded by forest for at least a couple of hours. After only a few hours of sleep and being in an uncomfortable posture, I woke up in the middle of the night, bewildered, but not terrified. I looked around and saw everyone fast asleep in this pitch-black vehicle, so I felt rather alone. I attempted to fall back asleep, but it didn't work, so I sat there for a bit, bored. It was pitch black outside the window, so I couldn't tell where we were. Fortunately for me, I packed light and had a couple of flashlights in my backpack. To avoid disturbing my sleeping family, I reached into the back seat, opened my bag, and brought out a small plastic yellow flashlight. It wasn't the brightest, but it was sufficient to view the foreground of the surrounding area. I placed it against the window, making no noise, and turned on the little switch. I put my face to the window and stared outside. At first glance, it appeared to be a typical tree line with some shrubs, trees, and anything else. But as I surveyed the darkness for animals, houses, and so on, I observed this black object standing between these two trees in the distance. It resembled the shape of a man, yet it did not move. It just sits there. After viewing it for a while and seeing no apparent evidence of movement, I believed it was a shrub or some other natural phenomenon. Just as I was going to turn off the light and go back to sleep, I noticed this shadow figure spin 90 degrees and disappear behind a tree. I was so shocked to my spine that I was shivering in fear. I threw the light and wrapped my blanket-turned sweater around my head, tightly closing my eyes and hiding my ears. I was paralyzed with fear and unable to sleep. I sat in this semi-fetal position, gripping my flashlight for the rest of the night. I waited until the light came up and we were back on the road to get any sleep. I did not tell anyone about the man I saw in the woods. Story 3. The Deranged Stranger. I got married just a few months ago. My wife and I just took a road trip to Washington, D.C. We decided to go see some family members, and the journey was entirely normal. We left home early in the morning and arrived at the motel by dusk. We departed at noon on our way back home, although most of the journey was at night. The journey took roughly 10 hours each way, not including pauses for food. We stopped for supper twice. First after roughly 3 hours of driving, and again much later and further into the night. We exited the highway at 1:30 p.m. and headed to the nearest Wendy's for dinner. Following that, we returned to the motorway. I had to eat while driving, which my wife didn't like, but I just wanted to get home sooner rather than later. Shortly after I returned to the motorway, it began to rain, and my wife pushed me to stop. She didn't want me eating and driving in such awful weather. As I drove over to the side, it began to pour down heavily. We heard a banging at the window as soon as I finished my food. At first, I assumed it was storm noise, but when I peered out the window to my left and saw a person blocking 90% of the glass, coupled with my wife's shriek, I almost passed out. I didn't want to roll down the window considering how hard it was raining, but the heavy rain banging on the car drowned out what the person was saying. I opened the door slightly and shouted at the individual, who turned out to be a lady. She was already soaking and appeared disheveled and afraid. She requested a ride. What were you proposing I tell her? No, in this type of condition. I asked her to get into the back seat. My wife flashed me a penetrating look as if to ask, "What the hell are you doing?" "You allowed her in," I asked the woman where she was going, and she did not respond. I saw my wife giving me another look, so I ignored her and turned around to look at the woman in the back seat, figuring she hadn't heard me. But as weird as it was, She was staring directly at me with a cold, unpleasant expression. It was a neutral, blank face, yet something about it seemed off-putting. I repeated my question, and she simply shrugged and shifted her face to the other side. I looked at my wife, who was once again staring at me. And right then, I announced aloud that I'd be dropping the woman off in the next town we passed. I suppose I was declaring this to both my wife and the woman. As we returned to the empty highway, I heard an ear-piercing scream from behind me, and the woman seated behind me put her arms around my throat. As I struggled to breathe, I slammed the brakes and nearly skidded into the divider. My wife sliced the woman's face with her long nails. The yelling became crazy and violent, with screams of anguish and torment. I did manage to get out of the car. However, she had her hands pushed to her face in anguish, so I unlocked the rear door, grabbed the woman with both hands, and flung her out of the car into the rain. She began begging, "Please, please," over and over as I stared down at her. But that was all she said. She wailed as she repeated, "Please." I ignored her and went back into my car, locking it. As I put the car in gear, there were knocks at the glass, and the woman began screaming again. Her shouts again sounded like those of a crazy mental patient. I drove away nonchalantly. She was no longer a serious concern, or at least not to my knowledge. My wife and I instantly called the police and informed them about a strange, unstable woman loitering near the highway. We didn't stop again. We drove straight home, obviously shaken up. But I didn't want to ponder about what happened any longer than necessary. For more scary videos, go check out our previous video, 3 True Hotel Horror Stories. See you in our next video.